Hello and welcome to another episode of App Stories. I'm John Voorhees and I've got Federico Fetici here with me. Hey, Federico.
Hello, John. How are you?
I'm doing all right. You look relaxed after a fairly busy week.
Yes. I am relaxed now. I took some time off yesterday, and then this morning I finally was it's the middle of the day and I only have one task left in my task manager, which is a good sign. I caught up on a bunch of things this morning. I prepared all my shows. I even was able to do a couple of things, which is one, play 20-30 minutes of Pokemon Legends ZA, and even experiment with some web browsers on my Mac. So yeah, this is probably going to be a whole episode of App Stories. Not today, because this is not what we have prepared.
Right.
But I really do want to have an in-depth conversation about these agentic browsers, like these AI browsers that everybody's making. And I don't know, I really struggle to understand some aspects of these browsers.
I have very strong opinions about these browsers.
Yeah, me too. So we'll talk about browsers at some point. But yes,
All
just
right.
today I spent some time with Safari, Comet, Google Chrome, Firefox. What else? Probably missed something
Atlas,
else.
maybe?
And Atlas, of course, the new ChatGPT browser, which is kind of underwhelming, in my opinion, so far.
Yeah, I set it as my default browser for about 4 hours, and I was like, nope.
Yeah, because I feel like, and again, this is going to be a separate episode. I feel like you can get most of what Atlas is with more features with Google Chrome, and if you want, the Claude extension for Google Chrome. And
Right, or the Gemini integration or whatever.
So, but we're not
That's
here
another
to talk.
day.
That's another day.
Another
What did
day.
you want to talk about, John?
Well, so first of all, I have a bit of follow-up because we recorded fairly early the last episode, which was all about kind of what we would imagine might be the next AI steps for Apple. And not, I don't know, 3 hours after we finished recording last week, Anthropic announced Skills, which is a new feature for their chatbot. And it's kind of right in the core of what we were talking about, which is the ability to, kind of bring together automation and other aspects of what you're doing on your devices and use it to do different tasks. And so today, I think for the post show for AppStories Plus listeners, we're going to talk about Claude Skills, which is a brand new feature. If you're interested in listening to that post show, you can either join Club Premier by going to plus.club. Club Premier is our all-access Club Mac Stories membership that includes App Stories Plus and a whole bunch of other things. Or you can subscribe directly to App Stories Plus by going to appstories.plus. So that's going to be the conversation for the post show. But for the main episode, I wanted to talk to you about your M5 iPad Pro review.
So the reason why I needed to relax. Okay.
Yes, the reason why you needed to relax, because I was watching from afar, feeling guilty because I had guests in my house this week. And you were like, I think Monday night was the peak of your stress, when it was like, I was getting texts from you. It was like 8:30 at night. I'm like, oh, that's really late in Rome. And you and Finn, who's in Ireland, were working together trying to deal with some local LLM things. And it's like, oh boy, those guys are up late. And I'm just here hanging out, having a drink with my brother-in-law.
Yeah. So let me preface this conversation by saying that I chose to write about the performance of local LLMs because that's exactly what Apple advertised for these new iPads. I could have done what other people do on a regular basis, which is you just put out a short review and you say, this is a chip bump, it's a spec bump. Here's your Geekbench score. Here's your battery life comparisons. Here's a couple of pictures of the accessories that still look the same, and call it a day. And I could have done it. I could have done it in 3 hours. I could have done that in the same morning of the embargo. But I thought, and some people didn't necessarily appreciate. So my bad for actually, thinking that I owe it to MacStories readers to actually dig in and try to analyze what Apple is saying in their press materials, including the materials they sent to me directly, to actually verify independently, without taking them at their word, if the numbers and the benchmarks for local LLMs, which is a thing that they had in a footnote of the press material, if that was actually true. So that was my approach, because it's my job to do that.
It is, and I do want to pause there just for a second, because I do think that that's important. I think it's important that Apple's held to account for what they say their hardware can do.
I think so.
And the focus here this year with this particular iPad was on local LLMs and on gaming. Just those two things. There was not the usual artists doing art, video makers doing videos. There's very little of that. It was almost entirely
a couple of mentions of video rendering and video transcoding.
Yes, a couple of mentions, but the lion's share of it was on LLMs and video games. And those are things that, as you knew going in, are not easy on an iPad. So it's like, well, if they're saying this is easier all of a sudden, let's see if that's true. And that's kind of like, that was kind of your thesis going into the review.
Yeah. And I mean, there are plenty of other reviews that took a different approach, and this is the approach I took. But so the reason why I was stressed the night before is that I based my entire review on this idea of, if Apple is saying that there is a 3.5x improvement in running local LLMs on an iPad, first of all, I know for a fact that it is not easy to install local LLMs on an iPad, because independently from the performance, there is no strong app ecosystem to do that. That's a separate conversation. But even if we are able to find the apps to test those large language models running locally, are they really better than before?
Right.
And so my entire story, or the majority of my story, was based on that idea of, how did Apple actually benchmark those LLMs running on an M5 iPad Pro, and can I replicate that setup? And that was a lot more challenging than I thought.
Yes.
And I can take you through the steps to sort of add a bit more context.
Yeah, I would like you to do that, because I think one of the things about Apple footnotes, when you look at these press releases, that they're very hard to decipher sometimes. And you did a little bit of guesswork and a little bit of digging into past announcements from Apple to kind of figure out what you thought was the model that they were using to come up with the 3.5x improvement.
Yeah, so when you're under embargo from Apple, they send you, obviously, in addition to the review unit, they send you a bunch of press materials, right? That sort of cover all the major marketing points and paint a slightly more in-depth picture than the post on the Apple newsroom about a product, right? Because they want to make sure, rightfully so, they want to make sure that you got all of the technical details correct, and that you have a sort of like a jumping point for the major aspects of the product. So there's these documents, and in one of these documents, I found this, when they mentioned the same number that they had in their press release, which is a 3.5x improvement for intensive local AI tasks, there was a footnote indicator next to it. And when I found the footnote, it said something very specific, which is that they measured time to first token. That is one of the key metrics when evaluating a local LLM. How long it takes the large language model to display the first token for its response. Like first token, when does it appear? How long between you entering your prompt and the LLM processing your prompt and displaying the first token? Not the total time it takes to generate the whole answer, but just the time to start, right? So they measured the time to first token with an 8 billion model using floating point 16 activations in 4-bit and with a 16,000 token prompt. So a long prompt with an 8 billion parameter model using FP16 activations. That was and a pre-release version of MLX. That is the sort of the core point of this conversation. Yes. MLX, if you're not aware, MLX is an incredible open source project created by Apple.
Yeah, it's one of the bright points, right? It's one of the bright spots of Apple and AI.
One of the bright spots of Apple in AI. It's a framework that taps into the unified memory architecture of Apple Silicon and takes advantage of neural accelerators in the CPU from last year and new this year in the GPU. In addition, of course, to the processing power of the CPU and the GPU and the unified memory of an M-series chip, now they have these accelerators. And the MLX framework allows you to run local large language models of all kinds, right? Vision models, text models, on Apple Silicon with sometimes, quadrupled performance of a non-MLX framework. So MLX is not a model, it's a framework, it's a format for you to install large language models on an Apple computer.
Right, and to take advantage of their hardware very specifically.
Yes. To use MLX, which most people do on a MacBook or on a Mac, right? Because you have a terminal, because you have so many apps to choose from, you need to download a model that has been specifically converted in the MLX format.
Right, and things like LM Studio are very good for this. There are a lot of other apps, but you'll go into LM Studio and they have a catalog of various models, and you'll see that there's a whole category of MLX ones, and the MLX ones are very popular and show up almost day and date usually with new models, whether the company that's building the model makes it themselves or whether the communities around these models do it themselves.
Yeah. So MLX is one of the best things that Apple has done in AI. And Apple was saying that they noticed a 3.5x improvement with MLX on an iPad. That obviously piqued my interest. Now, the first struggle was the ecosystem of apps on the iPad. There is no terminal, there is no LM Studio, there is no Olama, there is no LLM by Simon Willison. Right. All of these tools that you want to... There's no MLX command line utility, which is another thing made by Apple and open source. All of these tools are not available on an iPad. And my main issue was that there are some apps for iPad that let you install and run MLX models, but crucially, they don't show you statistics. They don't have a benchmark mode. Right. You can use them, but you cannot objectively verify and measure numbers, statistics, right? Because they don't have a stats view. Right. I really wanted to try, what's it called? Locally AI. There is a new application native to iPhone and iPad that lets you use MLX models. An Apple Intelligence Foundation model, runs great on iPhone and iPad, looks super native, doesn't have a statistics view. So I couldn't measure, right? Unless I literally would have to sit there with a stopwatch.
Which is a pretty imprecise way to do it too.
It's not a great way to do it. And also even with a stopwatch, I couldn't measure tokens per second, for example, right? The statistics mode needs to be created in the software itself. So I only found one reliable way to have a benchmark mode and a stats mode in an iPad app. However, that was not an MLX client. It was a Llama CPP client. So for those who are not aware, Llama CPP is a really popular framework to run large language models that is written in C++, hence the name, and it's a really popular open source project. Llama CPP is the backend for a lot of these local LLM apps that you find on Windows, on Mac. They're all based, a lot of them are based on Llama CPP behind the scenes.
I assume that's true for Android too.
That is true for Android. And all of these Llama CPP based models are in the GGUF format. Right. That is something that I previously wrote on AppStories as well. I found this app called PocketPal AI. PocketPal for iPad shows you statistics, has a built-in benchmark mode, lets you download models in the GUF format from Hugging Face, which is a really popular open source community where you can download open source large language models, including MLX ones, but PocketPal does not support MLX. But I figured, well, Apple is saying that the M5 is faster anyway than the M4 because of, even when you exclude the new neural accelerators in each core of the M5 GPU, Apple is saying that the M5 is faster than the M4. So let's see if it makes any improvement when I run Pocket Pal. And from that perspective, I didn't see a 3.5x improvement. I saw a 1.2 to 1.5x improvement.
Right.
And that is just what I noticed in Pocket Pal, because it was not taking advantage of any neural acceleration for the M5. That is just the conventional, like the baseline improvement for the new cores in the CPU and the GPU of the M5.
Right, exactly. Throughout the M5, you've got all those improvements to the GPU, the CPU. You've also got faster internal memory, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So that was interesting because you know, I was able to showcase, like, with different models and different prompt sizes, that you are still getting an improvement even without M5 specific neural acceleration in the GPU. But that still left me a little bit disappointed in myself, because I really wanted to go the extra mile and replicate Apple's setup. Apple, of course, doesn't make an MLX app for iPad, right? I assume
they may internally, but
I assume they have an internal testing tool for that. But that is
somehow
not available.
they came up with the number, right? I mean, there's a way
they came up with a number. They came up with a number, and I really wanted to measure that number myself.
Yeah.
So I once again collaborated with one of your sons, Finn, to build a MLX native testing app for myself on the iPad that allowed me to download MLX models from the official MLX community on Hugging Face. And obviously that also involved trying to guess which model Apple may have used. Historically, Apple, when they announced the foundation model last year, they benchmarked against Llama 3 8 billion. Now there's a pretty good chance that Apple is using Llama 3.2 8 billion or Qwen 3 as an 8 billion version 2 that I know for a fact Apple is testing with MLX. So I was torn between those two. I ended up testing both. I tested both Llama 8 billion and Qwen 3 8 billion. So Finn built me this MLX client with all kinds of statistics, which was perfect because it allowed me to install the same app on the M4 iPad Pro, on the M5 iPad Pro, run the same model, run the same prompt. I kept copying and pasting the same prompts from drafts, which I was using to sync.
I was wondering how you were doing that. I was very curious. Yeah,
I was keeping them in drafts, and I could run the same prompt on either device, and Finn's app would show me the stats: total generation time, time to first token, tokens per second, millisecond latency per token, all that kind of stuff. Memory
all
used,
the standard stuff.
all the standard statistics. And here's the thing. Until the night before the embargo, I was basically using the old version of MLX because I realized that when Apple said we benchmarked a pre-release version of MLX, I assumed, wrongfully, I guess, on my part, I assumed that framework would be by default baked into the version of iPadOS 26.0.1 on the M5 iPad Pro.
Right.
That was not the case.
Right.
Finn's app was running against the default version of MLX.
Right. The one that I would be able to get if I just went to a directory and downloaded an MLX model.
Yes. The night before the embargo, and this is something that you can verify on Mac Stories, but you can also read Max Weinbach's story at Creative Strategies, posted the same exact thing that I did. Apple released, essentially like 15 hours before the embargo, a branch on GitHub of MLX with early support for M5 neural accelerators in the GPU. With instructions on how to get it going on an M5 Mac. And when it comes to the M5 iPad Pro, they simply said, well, it's you can test this on the M5 iPad Pro. We're going to on the M5 MacBook Pro. you can test on the iPad later this year when this will be officially out. And I thought, well, that's a bummer. I was 1 a.m., got in touch with Finn, and I said, Finn, is there anything that we can do here? There's this branch on GitHub, and they're saying that M5 iPad support will be out later this year. They gave me instructions on how to install it on a Mac. Can we do anything on the iPad? And it was like, let me check. So Finn manually changed in his code a whole bunch of dependencies and different commits. It was very messy, but he was able to force the iPad beta that we had on test flight to use the MLX branch from GitHub. And that was at that point, it's 2 a.m. And it was I need to, I need to get some sleep. I don't know, take care of this tomorrow morning.
Yeah.
And the thing is, it ended up like this. I was not able to install the MLX branch on my M5 MacBook Pro. I kept getting an error, multiple errors.
Yeah.
And so that's why I ended up not writing about the M5 MacBook Pro, because the only thing that I wanted to write about was not ready. And I couldn't get it to work. And on the iPad, despite Finn's work and despite this branch, I kept getting the same numbers. So I posted that. I wrote that, and I explained the situation. And my takeaway from all this, and the reason why I was stressed, is that I think the timing here could have been better. By default, here's what I think. I think is that if you are in this situation where you're trying to sell a spec bump iPad Pro that has a new chip, and your angle is gaming and local AI, I feel like if your angle is especially local AI, and you have in your press material a very specific type of benchmark, I would have made sure that members of the press who had these iPad Pro review units would be able to replicate your testing environment.
Yep.
That's
Agreed.
what I would have done. That's what I would have done, right? Instead of having to go through the trouble, because the fact that they posted this branch on GitHub the night before tells me that I was not the only person asking for this, right?
Yeah, I agree. Plus, even so, the fact that you had to go to the lengths of having someone create an app for you, whereas
that's if I were in Apple's shoes, I would have made sure that this MLX branch was ready, before sending out review units. I would have given journalists access to the same internal, because you got to have an internal testing app on your iPad internally at Apple that lets you run these benchmarks. Otherwise, and I don't think it's a terminal. I think they put together something pretty similar to Finn's app. I think that's what they have. I would have given journalists access to that application. It is not unheard of for Apple to give you access to a test flight during an embargo. We know that they do that. We've been on those test flights. That's what I would have done. And that was not the case. And so it was a bit of a bummer in that I really wanted to have those 3.5x improvements, because I really do believe, here's the thing, I really do think they're real.
Oh, I do too. I think those neural accelerators, we've seen enough from some other indications of the neural accelerators to think that that architecture is very powerful. It's just not being utilized by anything yet.
And Max Weinbach is more skilled than me, obviously, when it comes to local AI. He's an expert in this field. Yeah. He was able to get the M5 neural accelerators running on his MacBook Pro review unit the night before. I couldn't get it to work. And he posted some incredible results, like 3.6x improvement even.
Yep.
So the neural accelerators are absolutely real, and I do think that they make a difference. I'm just saying, from the iPad Pro side of things, the timing for review units and how this process was put together could have been better.
Right. And I think aside from that being one of the takeaways, is that the reality is that even though those numbers may be real, there's not really a way for people to take advantage of them right now.
And that is the other side of the coin, right? These are the details of this review specifically. But big picture, that is exactly the problem. Like, even if Apple, timed handle this differently.
Right.
Even then, right now, wouldn't change the overall narrative, which is if you want to do local AI development or local AI tinkering because you are an enthusiast, macOS is your best option, not iPadOS. So Apple obviously has to sell the M5 on the iPad Pro as an AI and gaming monster. The problem is that on iPadOS, unlike macOS, you don't have the same ecosystem. And part of it, I think in either case is Apple's fault, because you are at fault for not fostering that ecosystem and not creating the economic advantage for developers to make those kinds of apps on the App Store. But you're also at fault for not letting enthusiasts install software from the web like you can on macOS, right?
Yeah. And I think it's not a good response to say, well, why does any of this matter? Because nobody does local LLM stuff on their iPad.
Don't write it in a press release then.
Right. I think that there's that. And I think what Apple has done with these neural accelerators is if they can also foster the app ecosystem, they have created then the environment where running local LLMs privately and securely on device, powerful LLMs, is a much more reasonable thing to do as opposed to using an online cloud-based chatbot, which I think is a good thing. And I think that's kind of where we're heading with a lot of this. I mean, there are use cases where using a local LLM is preferable to using something cloud-based. And with things like the neural accelerators, that becomes more of a reality down the road if, and only if, though, you can get the apps that will allow you to do that on the iPad.
Yeah.
So, Federico, that's enough about AI. Let's talk about gaming, because this is, I've talked a lot about Apple and gaming over on NPC, and you got your review units right about the time we were recording NPC last week, and we talked in our NPC Excel segment for our Patreon subscribers about what Brendan and I suggested you test on the iPad Pro for gaming. And one of the things that I took away from the conversation was that my focus over the last year has been an awful lot on like the Mac and gaming on the Mac, where the options are greater. I think you run into a very similar situation with the iPad and the game availability and use of technology situation that you get from AI, really, because you were pretty limited in the games that are available that took advantage of the kinds of things that would take advantage of the M5 processor, right?
Yeah. I couldn't find a single iPad game with ray tracing support. Apple demoed ray tracing improvements and Metal Effects frame interpolation on macOS with Cyberpunk 2077 in an upcoming version of the game that I couldn't test. And obviously that game is not on the iPad. And I couldn't find any other game for iPad that had ray tracing.
Yeah, so I think they pointed out one that's coming in 2026, right?
Yeah, Arcanite's Endfield. That's what I saw. That had 4K, 120 frames, and ray tracing. Looked fantastic, but that is coming out in early 2026.
For what it's worth, too, I mean, there's a similar problem with the Vision Pro in that a lot of what was shown off with the Vision Pro from a gaming standpoint with the PSVR 2 controllers and that sort of thing, those aren't available either. Those games are only just starting to trickle in, and the PSVR controllers aren't available until November 11th themselves, at least as a separate purchase from the headset itself.
So I ended up testing Resident Evil 4 Remake and Assassin's Creed Mirage. Both of them are using Metal Effects upscaling, so you can set in Assassin's Creed Mirage, you can set a native resolution, so you don't have to use upscaling if you don't want to, and it runs basically the same across the M4 and the M5. Resident Evil always runs at a lower resolution and basically defaults to Metal Effects upscaling, and it looked horrible on both devices. So it looked terrible on both the M4 and the M5. The only difference that I noticed is that obviously the M5 GPU was faster because I was using your metal HUD overlay that you got me into.
Yep.
And I could see from the Metal overview panel that the M5's GPU was rendering each frame at a much lower latency than the M4. The M5's GPU took around 8 milliseconds to render each frame in Resident Evil 4 Remake, whereas the M4 took about 30 milliseconds per frame. However,
pretty big difference.
Pretty big difference. However, because the game is not taking advantage of that extra power, the game looked the same. And basically,
what is it, locked to 30 frames or something like that?
It's locked to 30 frames and to a lower resolution with metal effects upscaling by default. So it's like you're getting a sports car and you're stuck in traffic. Like you have all that power and you're just sitting idle.
And you're rolling down the street, right?
Yeah. So those were my gaming tests. And again, could have been a different story. Could have been different if there were more AAA games on the iPad. Could have been different if Cyberpunk 2077 was on the iPad. Could have been different if and this is sort of my overall takeaway. I really do think there's an angle here for Apple. This is something that we discussed with Brandon on NPC. There is a simple angle for Apple here, which is to say we are making a Valve Proton-like compatibility layer to let you run any Steam game on your Apple computer, thanks to the power of Apple Silicon. But they're not doing that. They're not doing that now. So.
And then, you know what? I think it's absolutely doable where they are with that technology. I mean, I think there'd probably be a lot of work to do, but I think they could absolutely get there. So let's just wrap up, Federico. I want to get your overall take about the M5. I guess from two perspectives. One is someone like me who has an M4 iPad Pro, and then maybe someone who has an older iPad Pro or is looking to upgrade to an iPad Pro. Like, what does the M5 get them, and who is it for, I guess?
I think if you have money to spare and you don't care about the expense and you always want to be on the bleeding edge, then by all means get the M5. If you are a regular person, though, I would say consider, if you have an M4, stay on the M4. Unless there is something super critical about the neural acceleration, or there's a very specific app that you use for production work on a daily basis, and you know for a fact that it's going to be so much faster on the M5, then that's the sort of asterisk that I would understand. Otherwise, consider the upgrade only if you are on the M1 or M2 iPad Pro. Right, those are
Makes sense.
The M2 is from 3 years ago. The M1 is from 4 years ago. So it's time for an upgrade probably. If you have an M4 iPad Pro, you're basically gonna miss out on fast charging and 4K at 120 hertz on external displays
and Wi-Fi 7, I guess.
And Wi-Fi 7,
which isn't a big deal when it was already on 6E, the M4.
Yeah, so it's all right.
All right, Federico. Well, I'm glad that you've got that out and into the world and had a chance to relax a little bit this week.
Thank you.
We will be back next week with another episode of App Stories. As I said at the top of the show, we'll be talking about Claude Skills in the post-show. So if you want to listen to that, you can subscribe to AppStories Plus at appstories.plus or join Club Mac Stories Premiere, which is plus.club. And for that, you can find us on social media too. Federico is at Viticci. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees. JOHNVOORHWS. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.